Hi everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. This is Kathy, and this is the first of a whole bunch of cards using the B-Day stamp set from Pink and Maine. And for this card, I am also going to be using the Celebrate paper pad, which is also from Pink and Maine. And I've not made a shaker card in a really long time, but I thought the Beehive from this stamp set was pretty much perfect to make one. So that's what I decided to do. I started out by stamping the Beehive onto a piece of 80-pound Neenah Solar White cardstock. I'm using my favorite things, Extreme Black Hybrid ink, and I stamped it a few times because it was a new to me stamp and it had not really been seasoned yet. After I had stamped the Beehive, I just started coloring in with my Copics. As I switch colors, they're going to pop up in the left-hand corner for you so you know what colors I used. For the Beehive, I wanted to make sure that I had a really strong center highlight so that it would appear to be nice and round. And I really did very basic shading for this Beehive as well as the branch and the leaves. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and play some music while I finish up the coloring. And then I'll be back to give you a few tips on what not to do when making a shaker card. Now that the Copic coloring is done, I'm moving on to the little banner that's hanging across the Beehive. And I used jelly roll pens with glitter in them to add the color. I thought it would be fun to have some sparkle on the banner, and it also coordinated really well with the patterned paper that I chose to use with the card. However, this was my first wish I wouldn't have done that thing on this particular card. I really do like the glitter jelly roll pens, but the glitter sometimes will smear, and to prevent that, I thought, well, if I just kind of did a little bit of clear lacquer over it, which you could use glossy accents, you could use any, I think Tonic has one. This one that I'm using I received from Hero Arts in one of the kits a while back. Anyway, that was the second I wish I wouldn't have done that, was adding that crystal lacquer. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. But moving on to actually creating the shaker part, I have a piece of craft foam and I used a circle die to cut the circle out of that. I used the same size circle die to cut a circle out of my patterned cardstock. And then I trimmed down a piece of acetate just with my scissors to put behind the patterned paper. Oh, but before I did that, I used 2 circle dies to create a frame to go on the front of the card. The craft foam that I'm using is actually self-adhesive. It's got a liner on one side of it, and it is super sticky. So I thought that instead of trying to use liquid glue and having it squish out all over the acetate, I put the acetate on top of the sticky side of the craft foam and then added the patterned paper on top of that. I did have to add a little bit of adhesive up around the top of the patterned paper since the adhesive of the craft foam was covered up with the acetate. The next thing I did was figured out the placement of where the little beehive was going to go behind the window. I placed the patterned paper on top of that and used a pencil just to kind of lightly draw where I was going to need to cut the cardstock. There are two cute little bees within the stamp set, and I wanted to make sure that I added them within the shaker. So I placed my frame over it just as a placeholder so I would know where to stamp them. And as you can see right there, I don't even know how I got a little bit of a smudge of ink. I'm not sure if it was on the block or if it was on my finger. I don't even know. But I figure I could fix that later. And one of the lines on the bottom of the bees didn't really stamp very well, and it's not because of the stamp. I can pretty much guarantee it was the stamper. But that was a quick fix with just a fine tip black pen. I did color those bees in very simply. I mean, they're so tiny, there was no reason to even try to do any shading. So I just used a yellow marker for the bodies and then a blue-green marker for their wings. One other thing that I did was just did a tiny little dot to add an eye for each of the tiny little bees there as well. I also used a black Copic just to darken up the stripe on the little bees as well. And this is, I wish I wouldn't have done that, part 3, because I didn't let the glossy accents or the crystal lacquer dry quite enough, so it was still a little bit tacky, and I was going to go put it in my paper trimmer, and I noticed that it started to stick to my paper trimmer. So I had to take that out and just use scissors to trim that down, which in hindsight I knew that would happen, and I probably should have just grabbed the scissors anyway. When I went over the wings on the bees with my glitter pen, it started to leak because I squeezed too hard, so I used a paper towel to dab up the extra glitter. So as you can see, this has kind of been a comedy of errors, but I was able to pretty much fix everything, and I'm still really happy with how the card turned out. So the next step was to adhere the white circle frame over the window on the patterned paper. I used liquid glue for that and just made sure that I held it in place for a second or two so it had a chance to grab on. The next step was to grab the sequins and pour some over the beehive, and I'm not sure where I got these sequins. I'm pretty sure they're from Pretty Pink Posh. I was really happy that I had them because they matched that patterned paper almost perfectly, as well as my little glittery sticky banner. So I added some sequins, and then I wanted to see if I had enough, and I thought I could probably use a few more. So I just dumped a little bit more in there. Next was to adhere the patterned paper on top of the beehive. So I made sure to put a lot of adhesive around the circle itself so the sequins stayed put. And then I ran my fingernail along the inside of the circle just to break up any adhesive to make sure that the sequins did not stick to the side of the circle. And remember the glossy accents and how I said that was, I wish I wouldn't have done that, number 3? This is why. When I shook the card, the sequins stuck to the banner. I was able to hit the back of it with my fingernail, and it did loosen them up. But there is one sequin that is still stuck to the banner. But that's okay, because maybe that one was just going to be, super sparkly. Next up, I adhered that down to a piece of pink paper. The patterned paper, by the way, is trimmed down to 4 by 5 1/4. The pink paper is cut down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. And then I adhered that to the front of a top folding A2 size note card. The final step was to add a sentiment, and I really wanted to kind of balance it out along the bottom. So I did a strip that is 4 inches long and then the width to accommodate the sentiment. For the sentiment, I stamped that in VersaFine Onyx Black ink because it always gives a nice crisp impression. And you saw I taped down the strip onto my craft mat, and that's just to make sure that I didn't move it while I stamped it. And I thought that the edges were a little bit plain, so I brought out those little bees and added one to each side. Again, very simple coloring with those little bees, and I did add a buzzy trail with my fine tip pen. I adhered that to the front of the card, and that finishes up for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. And I do have, I think, probably 3 more using this set. So we'll see you soon. Thanks again.